In the last section, we've seen that the average total cost is the total cost divided by output. We can also define the marginal cost as the change in a firm's total cost from producing one more unit of a good or service. So with the formula we have below, see marginal cost equals the change in total cost divided by the change in the quantity. Remember the little triangle, that's the Greek letter delta. That symbol means the change in. So when we use that in formulas, we mean the change in whatever variable it comes in front. Sometimes the change in the quantity equals 1, so we can ignore the bottom line. So the marginal cost is just the change in the total cost. But that's something you want to avoid getting in the habit of doing, or you'll make mistakes when the quantity changes of more than one unit. Now the idea of marginal cost is important because firms consider producing an additional unit or using an additional unit of labor. They don't just think of the total lump sum, they think of what's going to be the change in cost from one additional unit of labor. So we can visualize the average and the marginal cost of production with a graph. So we have the chart there on the upper right, the same variables in it. So the quantity of workers, the quantity of pizzas, the marginal product of labor, total cost. But now we've added marginal cost of pizzas, the average total cost of pizzas. The first two workers increase the average production and cause the cost per unit to fall. And we see that over time, the next 4 workers are less productive, resulting in a higher marginal cost of production. So since the average cost of production follows the marginal cost down and then up, this generates a U-shaped average cost curve. Now in this section, we're going to be graphing the cost curves. So we'll graph the average total cost, the average variable cost, the average fixed cost, and the marginal cost. Now I know talking about, just creating all these graphs seems really boring. And it might not be the most exciting thing in economics, but we're going to use these a lot over the next 4 chapters, so it's important to understand why the curves follow the shapes they do, so then we can use them in the future. And so it's easier to remember them in the future, instead of just simply memorizing what each one looks like. Now we know from the previous section that total cost can be divided into fixed and variable costs. Now if we divide both sides by the output, this gives us a useful relationship. The first quantity, the total cost divided by the quantity, is the average total cost. The second is the average fixed cost, or the fixed cost divided by the quantity of the output being produced. And the third is the average variable cost, the variable cost divided by the quantity of output produced. So the average total cost equals the average fixed cost plus the average variable cost. Now the average total cost, the average variable cost, and the marginal cost are all U-shaped. A marginal cost crosses the average total cost and the average variable cost at both of those lines' minimum point. Now this isn't happenstance. This happens based on their mathematical relationship. As output increases, the average fixed cost is going to decrease. So it has a downward sloping curve. Now this is because even though the average variable cost is increasing, the fixed cost is going to remain the same no matter how many units you produce. So as you produce more units, the average fixed cost is going to decrease. Also, you should note that the vertical sum of the average variable cost and the average fixed cost is the average total cost curve. So that relationship that we talked about on the previous slide holds. Now that's in the short run. Now let's look at these relationships in the long run. In the long run, all costs are variable, so there's no difference between the fixed and the variable cost. While firms must try to maximize their short-run profits, they also consider the longer run. So in the long run, Jill, from our previous example, could choose to buy more pizza ovens or to expand her restaurant. So the long-run average cost shows the lowest cost at which a firm is able to produce a given quantity of output in the long run when no inputs are fixed. Now, at lower quantities of goods being produced, a firm might experience what's called economies of scale. So economies of scale is when the firm's long-run average cost falls, it increases the quantity of output it's producing. So here we have an example of a small car factory that can produce at a lower average cost than a large one for smaller quantities. So for more output, a larger factory is more. This may occur because of large-scale mechanical processes. It also occur because of specialization and division of labor. So when you have many workers, each worker can focus on one small component of the job, and they can become really good and really efficient at that. Whereas a small company with only a few workers have to take on multiple tasks, so they don't get to specialize as much. There's also other things that happen. They can buy in bulk from producers of intermediate goods. So maybe Giant can sell produce cheaper than Smith Myers can because Giant's buying a lot more of the fresh produce every day than Smith Myers. And you can also have savings on administrative costs from spreading management costs across their different business lines. So here we see a small factory can produce small quantities of goods at a higher average cost than the larger one. So in this case, 20,000 cars being produced in a small factory is good, but at 200,000 cars, a larger firm has a much lower average total cost. So the large car factory, say Ford, compared to a small car factory, can produce a lot more units and do so at a lower cost. Now, the lowest level of output at which economies of scale are exhausted is known as the minimum efficient scale. So at some point, growing larger does not allow for greater economies of scale. The firm experiences what we call constant returns of scale. So its long-run average cost is not going to change even when it increases output. Once they reach that minimum efficient scale, if we experience a flatlining for a while. Like we see in the figure on the right, the long-run average cost curve between the 200,000 cars being produced and the 400,000 cars produced is going to have the same average cost. So even as you're growing larger, your returns to scale aren't increasing. They're exactly the same. Now, eventually, firms can grow so large that they reach a size that they experience a diseconomy of scale. Now, this is a situation in which a firm's long-run average cost is going to rise as a firm increases output. Now, this might happen because the firm gets too large to effectively manage, becomes too difficult to keep track of all the moving pieces, or it gets stymied with bureaucracy that just increases their cost without improving their ability to function. Or maybe it is employing workers and other factors of production that are less well suited to production, so they're increasing the cost because they're not able to produce as well. It's a really simple drawing I made myself in Paint to try to illustrate the three relationships. So first you have the economies of scale on the left. That's when average cost is decreasing. Then there's a constant returns to scale. So in that place, even when you increase the quantity being produced, the average costs aren't changing. They're increasing one for one with the production. Then finally, we reach a certain point at quantity 2 on this graph where the firm experiences diseconomies of scale. So the average cost is going to be increasing as they increase production. Let's look a little bit more at automobile factories. So why might a car company experience economies of scale? Well, first, production might increase at a greater than proportional rate as the inputs increase. So as you're adding more labor or more capital, you're able to produce even more than a proportional increase. Having more workers can allow for specialization. So like I've said, employees can develop skills. They can just focus on one area and become much better at that than if they had to do several different tasks. And finally, large firms may be able to purchase inputs at lower prices. But these economies of scale will not last forever. Eventually, managers have difficulty coordinating these huge operations, and there's just too much for any one person to be able to effectively manage. So there's a nice quote from the president of Toyota's Georgetown plant. They say, "Demand for high volume saps your energy. Over a period of time, it erodes our focus and thinned out the expertise and knowledge we painstakingly built over the years." So eventually, as firms become too big, it becomes too difficult to operate. You come into all these problems, and it makes it more expensive for them to operate at even larger sizes. So for those of you worried about monopolies, think of one of the last seasons of BoJack Horseman. They joke about, a combination, a conglomerate of like 20 of the different largest companies. Eventually, with one monopoly is going to rule the world. And in fact, because companies experience diseconomies of scale, eventually, once they grow past a certain size, they become too cumbersome, too bureaucratic, too slow, and it costs too much money to maintain. So we should not expect to have one monopoly because of the diseconomies of scale. Henry Ford discovered diseconomies of scale the hard way. So obviously we know him for his success at creating an assembly line and using it to produce cars at extremely low cost. allowed him to build up a division of labor within his firm. So because we had all these different people focusing on just one small component of the job, they became much more efficient than we saw with other firms that were still having small teams build a car from the ground up. So, hoping to build on this, Ford built an enormous industrial complex, and one of the largest factories ever in the River Rouge in Dearborn, Michigan, and that was going to produce the Model A. Now, this complex became so large that it did not allow an efficient production. There was a disconnect between workers and management, and it was just too unwieldy to effectively manage. So they ended up losing money on this production. So you see, there is a limit to how much more efficient firms can become as they increase their size. This slide contains a summary of the definitions of cost, has the term, the definition, and their symbol and the equation to calculate them. I'm not going to go through them each individually again, but I'm going to include this so that when you pull up the PowerPoint slides on your own, you can look at this and go through memorizing, making sure you know the different formulas.